No, not quite. Oh, sorry. Yes, it will.
Okay.
So there will be
Okay, yes.
4 million of profit in.
Okay, hello to all our viewers. I'm Gero. I have conducted more than 200 interviews and interview coachings at BCG, and I've now transitioned to professionally prepare candidates for their case interviews with a focus on teaching really how to think like a consultant to be successful in the interview. And today we will do a realistic BCG type of case interview with feedback in the end. And I'm quite happy that Alex is also here. Alex, perhaps you can introduce yourself shortly before we get started with the case.
Hi, Gero. Really nice to meet you. I basically have an engineering background, so I studied engineering at the University of Bath, and I'm very interested in getting into consulting. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Great. Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that's especially interesting. You know, as an interviewer, there are patterns when you interview people from different kinds of backgrounds. Engineers are, of course, a bit more inclined to numbers, and sometimes you have to kind of pull out the qualitative side of things a bit more in the
Yeah,
coaching, right? So let's see how it goes, and please give me a sign when you're ready to start.
amazing. Yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready to go. Cheers.
Great. Cool. So let's talk about the assignment for today, right? Perhaps you've heard about the company Volocopter, which is a producer of electric helicopters. And they have just obtained the required manufacturing license from the German authorities to start serial production. And just so you know how they look like, I will put them on the screen for a second. So, just take a look. This is what the volocopter looks like. It's
Yeah,
something between a plane and a helicopter. It's electric and it's used
yeah,
for taxi. I think that's about all you need to know about it, but it's always important to also have a picture in mind when talking about something.
for sure.
Great. So this company um, have these products which are designed for air taxi use. And the company now aims at becoming the first company offering commercial air taxi flights, with operations starting with the first commercial flights at the Olympic Games in Paris in 2024. So this year, that's their plan. And after having showcased their abilities at the Olympics, Volocopter really plans to start building a lucrative business. And to this end, they currently consider whether or not to go ahead with planning a commercial taxi route from the Munich train station to the Munich airport using one Volocopter air taxi. They would like to know from you now, right, Alex? Is that a good idea?
You, uh, Thanks for that, Joe. First of all, it sounds like a really interesting case. I've actually had a bit of experience with eVTOLs because I worked for a company that produces eVTOLs.
Oh,
But
cool,
so,
great.
is it okay if I just go over the information of the case to make sure that I understand everything correctly?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead. Let's make sure.
Okay, so our client is Volocopter, and
Mm-hmm.
they manufacture electrical vertical takeoff and landing aircrafts.
Mm-hmm.
And they've just received approval for serial production of these air taxis.
Mm-hmm.
And their goal is to provide the first commercial flight at the Olympic Games in Paris in 2024 as a promotional event, I would imagine.
Mm.
And after that, their plan is to build a lucrative business. And their first route that they're planning to do is going from an airport in Germany to a train station in Germany. If that is that correct?
And that's right. More
Yeah.
specifically, in the city of Munich. So,
Okay.
city of Munich airport, city of Munich central train station.
Okay. That will make sense. And they basically come to us to see whether or not that's a good idea in terms of the first route to do, or just whether it's a good idea in general.
Just whether it's a good idea in general to simplify it a bit. So,
Okay.
they are a bit of a startup. They are tech-oriented, so they really need support with strategic decisions like this. Previously,
Okay.
it has really been on developing the technology, but now they really have to make a decision if they want to pursue that.
Okay. So just a few clarifying questions about the company. So is there a specific reason why they've chosen this route from Munich airport to, is it because perhaps there's congestion between the two and therefore they need a faster route to travel from the Munich airport to the train station?
It's a bit of a mix of things, I would say. So it's a very frequented airport, with a lot of private and also business tourists, which is quite far away from the city, also far away from the central station in the city. So a lot of people have to bridge this distance frequently. And somehow this idea came up. And
Okay.
they really want to know if it's a solid idea, more as a yes or no question, as opposed to really kind of evaluating it compared to specific alternatives. So this is the only alternative that they are currently looking at.
Okay. Do we know how long it would take roughly for a flight in the eVTOL from the airport to the train station?
It's a good question. So the distance is roughly 40 kilometers between the central station and the airport. So, you see the airport is a bit outside the city. And it flies at around 160 kilometers per hour.
60 kilometers per hour. Okay. And it flies in a straight line, presumably.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Okay. And in terms of their okay, that makes sense. Is it okay if I just take a moment to structure my approach to
Mm-hmm.
um
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
okay.
Good idea.
So, could I just ask, so we're not trying to compare it to alternative options in terms of whether or not it's a good idea. It's more about whether or not it's a good idea. I'm a bit confused about whether it should be trying to compare that if it's a better solution to alternatives or not.
Rather not. So really only focus on if this is a good action to take for the company.
Okay.
However,
Okay.
whatever you might look at for this. But even if there is a better alternative,
Yeah.
for example, another airport to central train station connection in another city, you might still conclude that this is a good option to
Okay.
go. So
Okay.
ignore others.
Yeah. Okay. I understand. Okay. I think I'm ready to go if that's okay with you.
Great. Yeah, sure.
So the goal is to determine whether or not it's a good idea for Volocopter to uh, create a first flight route between Munich airport and Munich train station.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to address this question and to decide whether or not it's a good idea, I'd like to look at three levers.
Okay.
The first one would be the demand for this type of service.
Mm-hmm.
So how many customers would be willing to use this service? The second would be what other alternative transport options and how do they compare to this one for this specific route? And then the third one would be the financial considerations of and risks of actually implementing such a solution. So how much would it cost to put in place and run, and what kind of revenues could you expect?
Mm-hmm.
I've also just thought of a fourth potential category, which would be the implications for Volocopter itself in terms of how it promotes their brand and may be able to draw further investment.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to focus first on the demand because I think it's the most important factor when deciding whether or not it's a good idea to do this. So first, I'd like to understand how many people travel from Munich airport to the train station, and specifically of those, how many of them could afford more luxurious travel option, which would be faster flight option. I'd like to also understand what types of customers would be interested in this kind of service, and also what kind of price we can offer it at. So we know that it's it's presumably quite a fast travel option. And then moving on to the alternative transport, so the comparison between using an eVTOL and using an alternative transport option. I'd like to compare
What could such an option be? Just
so
to illustrate a bit.
Okay, so for example, so there's different kinds of transport that they could use. They could use private cars, they could use the train, they could use helicopters. But if we're comparing specifically to a high-end option, it would be more likely to be private cars or helicopters as the competitors to this product. And then looking at kind of specifically the costs per passenger mile for each of these different transport options, to decide whether it makes sense, and also compare the duration of travel for each of these methods. So basically compare the costs and the time for each of these options and see where that fits in with our customers.
Anything else you would also look at? So I see that for customers, probably the time it takes is important, and also, the price they have to pay. Anything else you would compare?
Another thing that comes to me is also I'll just take a moment to write down a few things if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So the other, apart from the cost and the time that it takes, another thing that I think is quite important is the customer experience in traveling. So first of all, I would imagine you get quite a nice view of the city of Munich when you're flying from A to B. And also, if you have a pilot who is very friendly and explains different aspects about the city, and perhaps before getting onto the flight, there could be also a lounge or something where they enjoy the experience.
Okay, so the experience is also important, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Besides price and the time it takes. I
Yeah.
agree with that.
Okay. And then moving on to the final factor that I'd like to consider, it would be the financial investment required to actually put this into place. So what kind of infrastructure would we need? So I would imagine there would be a need for landing stations at each end, perhaps several. So how much would it cost to build those, and how much would it cost to operate those? And also, would those belong to Volocopter, or do they belong to someone else, in which case they're paying a landing fee? The pilots. So there's the investment cost on one side, and then there's also the operational costs of actually running this service. So the pilots need the salary for the pilots, for the air control traffickers, for the people who help the customers board and purchase tickets as well. And then on the risk side of things, and then those would be all the costs, and then on the revenue side of things, the revenue be based on the ticket price and the number of journeys that the passengers can take. And then finally, on the risks side of things, what are the implications if there's an accident or something like that in terms of the volocopter and its future plans?
Mhm. Got it. Just a bit of a skeptical question to challenge
Okay.
you a bit. You know, do you think there might be an underlying assumption that you're making here that you don't explicitly discuss in your framework?
Underlying assumption. Um, and could you be a bit more specific about which part of an underlying assumption?
Yeah, yeah. So, what do you kind of take for granted?
Hmm. That they've already implemented the
I think you're going into the right direction, at least that
okay.
they could implement it, right? So
Yeah,
that they have the possibility of actually pulling this off.
yeah.
So, perhaps just take a few seconds to think about it and just tell me to
Okay.
check if it's actually possible for them to do what they have in mind. What are
Okay.
some things that you would also check before?
Okay. So then so would you like me to recreate a structure based on that kind of
Yeah,
question? Uh,
just a short one. You can
okay.
structure the answer in any way that you
Um,
want.
so I think that they need to consider the space possibilities. So whether or not they have the space to
Mm-hmm.
actually uh, land. Also, in terms of the flight zones, is there availability in the airspace?
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that I think would be quite crucial is pilots need to be trained to be
Mm-hmm.
able to operate these new types of aircraft. Um, so those would be the three main things apart from what I've mentioned in my structure, which would be the financial considerations of whether it makes sense to do it
Mm-hmm.
and whether there's demand for it.
And looking at the fact that it's a really new technology that hasn't really been tested as a
Yeah.
running business before, is there something else that you would want to check?
So I would so they've had their first license to produce it, but presumably there would
Mm-hmm.
need to be some testing of the aircrafts and many flight tests to
Mm-hmm.
ensure the safety of operating this aircraft with passengers in it. When you said license to produce it, does that
Mm-hmm.
mean that it's been certified by the like the authority, the
Yes, that's right.
regulators?
So it is actually certified by Germany and also by the European Union. However, as you pointed out, it's important to ensure safety, right? So
Yeah.
they will probably also need a more specific permit to,
Okay.
build what they have to build at the airport and the central station, a
Yeah.
permit to actually kind of operate the route.
Yeah.
And, also now they have the permit for manufacturing, but probably also some kind of final permit to actually fly these things in the first
Yes.
place, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Of course.
just to shed a
Yeah.
bit light on the regulatory perspective as well.
Regulatory challenges. Yeah, for sure.
Cool. But it's good that we discussed it. As a matter of fact, you can now ignore it because the client says that they have done some analysis. They are very positive that they can actually pull it off. They are very positive when it comes to regulation, that they can ensure the airspace and train the pilots and so on. So this is not an issue. And also they do think there will be sufficient demand to justify doing it. So the first branch of your framework also doesn't turn out to be a problem. And second, they are very positive that they can offer a competitive offering compared to other transport options.
Okay.
Regarding experience, price,
Yeah.
and duration. So this is also not an option. So what would you like to look at now? Sorry, I didn't say not an option. I meant this is also not an issue. So what would you like to investigate?
So assuming that everything is in place for them to
Mm-hmm.
actually be able to operate the flight route,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, so perhaps one thing to look at would be the impact that it would have on them as a company, because in the sense that if they manage to fly this route
Mm-hmm.
commercially, it would be the first ever in.
Okay, got it. Good point. I forgot it because you then had it as a fourth point in your framework, which I think is very good.
Yeah.
However, they are also very positive that they will have a strictly positive impact on the brand image and so on.
Okay.
So also
Okay.
no reason to further investigate that.
Okay. So another factor to consider, but not not a revenue factor, or is that what you're going towards?
Going towards what? What do you
So,
think? What's left?
but I was just wondering if would you be able to repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, just like what do you want to do now?
Oh, okay. So I'd like to start. So I'd like to look at what how many people would be traveling on this route, and so look at a few different things on both the cost and revenue side to decide
Okay.
whether or not the investment makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have any information on how much it would cost to build the infrastructure necessary
Mm-hmm.
to operate this route, and to so that would be a first cost, and then also I'd be interested in knowing
First, let's
about.
take it step by step
Okay.
so that I also can remember
Yeah.
what you asked. So, promising avenue to now calculate the business case and, tell them if you think it makes sense from a financial perspective. Regarding investments that they would have to make, can you give me some examples of what you think they would have to acquire?
So first of all, I think they would need to invest in landing areas
Mm-hmm.
for the eVTOLs, as well as
Very good.
taxiing areas.
That costs like the whole infrastructure of all the starting and taxiing areas and so on. This costs 2 million euros to set
Okay.
this up in the beginning. Good point.
Okay, and then there would be a cost presumably to build the aircrafts as well.
Yes, this one is quite expensive. It
Okay,
costs 10 million.
so is
Right
that per
then,
aircraft?
it's per aircraft, right? However, remember for the prompt, they really want to operate the route with one aircraft.
Yes. Okay, and okay, so that's that's on the investment side of things. Do we know how many times they can do the route per day? So I know that it's 40 kilometers and 160 kilometers per hour. But in
Mm-hmm.
terms of working out the revenue that they can expect, I would need to know the number of passengers, the price per ticket, and the number of times they can fly back and forth per day.
Mm-hmm. So, regarding the price, actually, they have figured out um, that research has shown customers would be willing to pay 2 times as much compared to a regular taxi, right?
Mm.
For the 40 kilometers distance. Um, and regarding the number of customers, you can assume a 50% utilization of the seats on the airplane.
Okay.
Um, and was there anything else you asked? Sorry, I forgot. I think you asked 3 questions.
So,
All right,
so
sorry, I
how many
remember.
people can sit in the aircraft?
I remember you asked, sorry, I just remembered you also asked how often they can fly.
Yeah.
So, we do know that they operate 15 hours a day. And there are 5 seats for taxi guests on the Volocopter aircraft.
Okay. So 5 seats. And then also, do we know whether there's an idle time between flights, or can I just assume that it's whatever the flight is and back and
Mm,
forth?
what do you think?
I think there should be an idle time because it takes time to onboard the customers and have the new customers aboard. And I would
So that will be
say,
very quick, perhaps if they are well trained.
yeah,
Might take a minute or so.
okay.
Do you think that's the only driver of idle time? What do you think?
No, also, if it's an electrically powered
Hmm.
aircraft, there will be time required to charge the aircraft as well.
Very, very good. Indeed, that's the case. So, recharging the whole volocopter takes 1 hour.
1 hour to recharge.
Hmm.
Okay.
That's right.
Um, so, and then do we have an idea of the cost of electricity as well, and the
Hmm.
cost of charging the aircraft?
Yeah, we do. So for one load of energy, they pay 400 euros.
Okay. So every time they land, they have to charge for 1 hour. Is that correct?
On what would that depend? What do you think?
It would depend somewhat on the utilization of the aircraft because it would consume more energy
Okay,
if it,
I
but
got it, but primarily,
um, oh, how much is flying?
yeah.
So
I
you
mean,
said
just on
that,
the capacity of the thing, right? I mean, just kind of if you load it, there's some kilometer amount that it can fly. I agree,
yeah,
if there are more passengers or perhaps very heavy passengers, might be a tiny bit shorter the distance, and if it has
yeah,
very few passengers, might be a bit longer. But on average, it can fly 90 kilometers with one full charge.
90. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, okay. I'm just gonna take a moment to structure everything I've got so that I come
Hmm.
with you to you with more organized kind of approach, if
Sure,
that's
please
okay.
kind of,
Yeah.
yeah, puzzle the pieces together and see which pieces you might be missing.
So, um, so you mentioned the price for the total charge of the aircraft. I didn't quite catch
Yeah,
that.
no problem. It's 400 euros for one charge. Otherwise, it's a lot of numbers, so feel free to
Yeah.
inquire.
Do we know the pilot salary?
That's a good point. You can assume that this one doesn't matter for some reason, so you
Okay.
can kind of leave it out.
Neglected.
Perhaps they have to pay these people anyway.
Okay.
I think there's one more piece of costs that might be interesting before you
Okay.
can do the total costs calculation.
Okay.
What do you think?
Um, so charging
Just one
is
more hint. You have already
I-
covered the whole investment, so I'm only talking about the yearly costs. And here,
yeah.
from what I understood, you only have
Oh,
the loading costs. But what else might be costs
is
that
there a
you
landing fee for the aircraft? Was that neglect?
there's not actually,
Okay.
so at least not
Um,
substantial. You can ignore it.
is there some sort of permit that they need to pay to actually fly the route?
Mhm. There's also not. The German
Okay.
government is so amazed that actually taxis fly that
Yeah.
they have skipped all the usual permits.
Um, okay, so ch the charging cost is what I have for the moment. Oh, maintenance cost, I would imagine, would be
Yes,
quite important. Uh,
that's right.
yeah,
So essentially, 5% of the acquisition price of a taxi is also due for maintenance each single year.
5% of the acquisition price per year. Okay.
That's right. And now you got all the costs.
Okay, so I'll start by working out the costs of the aircraft, and then I'll work on the revenues afterwards, if
Okay.
that makes sense.
Yeah, sounds good.
So so um, a full charge can fly 90 kilometers, and we know that the distance between the two airports is 40 kilometers. So can we assume that two flights can be conducted
Yes.
per, yeah?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So then two flights cost 400 euros then, and it's operating for 15 hours per day, but there's an idle time of 1 hour between. Is it between each flight, the idle time?
What do you think, if it's primarily due to loading and not to guests entering and alighting?
Do you mean to loading to charging the vehicle?
Yeah, that's right. So that's the driver of the idle time.
Okay. So it charge. Oh no, so it would be once every every time it returns. Yeah, of course.
Yes, well discovered. That's right.
So then if it's operating for 15 hours, so it would do flight time is. So I need to work out the duration of the flight. So that would be the distance divided by the speed at which it goes. So it would be 160 kilometers per hour divided by 4. Oh no, sorry. 40 kilometers divided by 160. So it's a quarter of an hour.
Okay.
15 minutes. So each flight takes 15 minutes. So if we work out the time that it takes for a whole cycle for the flight to go back and forth charge once, that would be 15 minutes plus. So it'd be 30 minutes plus the 1 hour charging time. So 1 hour and 30, assuming there's no waiting time at the other station. So 1 hour and 30. And then if we divide the number of hours per day by that'd be 15 divided by 1.5. So 10. So basically it can complete 10 trips per day.
Cool, sounds good.
So two flights cost 400. So the total cost per day would be 4,000 euros.
Okay.
Per day. So that's just the charging cost, and then the maintenance cost is 5% of the acquisition cost per year, which is 5% of 10 million, so 50,000 per year. 50,000.
Is it?
Wait, so 10 million. So 5% of 10 million. 5% of. Okay, sorry.
What's
10%?
Just say
10%. 10% of 10 million would be 1 million. Oh, so it's 500,000. Sorry.
Yeah, that's correct.
So 500,000, and then we need to work out how many flights per year. So are we assuming that it's operating? Is it safe to assume it's operating 300 days a year?
So essentially, with something where you pay so much money for, they would probably operate year round.
Okay.
So, perhaps there might be a few days where something very important happens, but at least it should be close to a full year.
So can I use 350 days per year then?
That's reasonable, probably. For the other days, there might be strikes, as we currently observe in Germany, or some other factors. 350 is good.
Okay. So then the total charging cost per year would be 350 times 400. So then that would be 300 times 400 would be okay, just one moment. So that would be So it's 3.5 times 4 times 10,000. So it would be 12 plus 2, so 14 times 10,000, which would be 140,000.
Sure.
Wait,
Check your zeros.
14 times 1,000 would be 14,000, and then 14 times 10,000 would be 140,000. No?
I mean, if it's 4,000 per day, and if you would have 300 days, then
It's 400 per
in
day.
3 days it's 12,000, and then in 300 days it would be 1.2 million already, right? Because it's 12,000 in 3 days. Add 2 zeros to it, 120,000, 1.2 million. So it must be over 1.2 million.
Okay. So then it's 1.4 million.
Yes, that sounds much better.
Okay.
It's always the zeros. The
Million,
number is always correct.
Okay. So then we've got 1.4 million plus 500,000 in maintenance fees per year. So we've got 1.9 million in cost per year.
Okay.
And then on the revenue side of things, we've got 5 seats with 50% occupancy. And so I'm just 2 times. So do we know the price of a regular taxi?
It actually goes at 2.50 euros per kilometer.
2.50 euros per kilometer. So I'm going to work out the price for one flight, assuming 50% utilization, and then multiply that by the number of flights per day and then per year.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds good, I think.
So 2.50 euro per kilometer. So it'd be €5 per kilometer for the eVTOL for the aircraft. So if we've got 5 seats and 50% utilization, is it okay to use 2.5 as a number of people that are in the
Yeah, on average this will be precisely right.
Okay. So the number of so I'm going to work out the number of flights per year, which is going to be so 350 days times we worked out so in 1 hour 30 there's 2 trips that can be done. So then 10 trips per day, 10 trips per day. So 350 times 10 trips per day. So that's 3,500 flights, individual flights. And then if we multiply that by the number of people per flight, which is 2.5, and then by the price per kilometer, which is also 2.5, and then by the number of kilometers per flight, which is...
But perhaps there was a misunderstanding. The price of 2.50 is actually for taxis.
Oh, sorry.
So that's quite regulated.
So it's
perhaps
times 5.
I said that wrongly.
No, you didn't. It's me. So times 5, which is the price for the air taxi. And then we need to multiply it by so that's the number of flights, and that's the number of people per flight, and the price, and then the number of kilometers per trip, which is 40 kilometers. So then if we do 40 times 2.5, that gives us 100. And then we've got that times 3,500 and times 5. So then it's 500.
Oh, hang on, but now you did 40 times, sorry, you did 40 times 2.5, but I think you meant 40 times 5, right? Because we figured that the...
No, because I did the 2.5 for the number of passengers, not for the number of...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
So 40 times 2.5, the number of passengers is
Okay.
100, and then times 3,500, which is the number of flights per year, and then times 5, which is the number of the price per kilometer. So then that gives 500 times 3,500. And then, so that's times. So it's 15 plus 2.5. So 17.5 times 10 to the 5. So it'd be 1.75 million revenue
On a yearly basis already,
on a
right?
yearly basis.
Okay. Just one question. I think you calculated with 10 flights, right? So what's the assumption here that you're making?
So I'm assuming there's 10 trips per day per
And how
aircraft.
would that look like in practice? What does it mean for the aircraft?
If there's 10 trips, oh, that's 10 return trips.
Yes,
Okay,
otherwise it would
okay,
stay very empty on one way.
okay.
So
Yeah.
what would you just have to do with your final
So
number
then
with the
just
1 point?
multiply it by 2.
Yes, okay.
So then it would
That sounds
be
good.
3.5 million
Mm-hmm.
in revenue. That's a lot
Okay.
better for Volocopter.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then if I work out, the idea being to work out the kind of time that it would take for them to break even, based on their initial investment and their
Mm-hmm.
revenue per year.
Indeed, remember they talk about lucrative. We didn't really clarify what that means in the beginning. They
Okay,
think that, it should really pay off within 10 years. So within 10 years, they want to have made a profit from it.
okay.
That's right.
Is
So
there a specific profit, or is that when they want to break
no,
even?
it's zero. So
Okay.
10 years to break even. They allow
Even
themselves.
in 10 years. Okay. So do we are those the costs and the revenues expected to change on an annual basis? Are we expected to increase the utilization of the
Mhm.
aircraft over the years?
Good question, but you can expect no change.
Okay. So the annual profit will be is going to be 3.5 million, which is the revenue minus 1.9.
Mm-hmm.
So that's uh, oh, that's 1.6 million in annual profit.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the total investment cost is 12 million.
Okay.
So if we
So
do,
do you think it will pay off in 10 years?
no, not quite. Oh, sorry. Yes, it will.
Okay.
So there'll be
Okay,
4
yes.
million, 4 million of profit in by year 10.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. So, just kind of as an outcome, I
Yeah.
think you're correct that it would pay off in 10 years. So, thanks for doing the business case. I think this will be very helpful to the client. Of course, we do have some assumptions here, as you already correctly identified. We expect everything to stay the same. And, we know that the client is a bit concerned that the prices might decrease a bit, for whatever reason, just because,
Okay.
it's a critical factor, of course. Can you just perhaps give me some reasons or what might drive the price down in the future?
Well, I would expect that as they get certified and start flying, other competitors will do the same. So, for example, Joby Aviation is one of the major players as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that I would expect would drive the prices um,
Mm,
down because there would be more competition between the two. Other factors might be the fact that there's perhaps a more developed infrastructure on the ground, which might
mm,
mean that the prices on the ground are lower, which would force Volocopter to lower their prices as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's fair. Especially in Munich, they've been thinking about another way of connection with a faster train for the last few years. So of course,
Okay.
this
Yeah.
might play a role. Also, the factor of it being new and so fancy and everyone wanting to try it out will probably lose its appeal a bit.
Yeah.
But I agree with your two factors as being a bit more important than that. Yeah, so I mean, thanks for analyzing this. Um, let's take a few seconds and just come up with a recommendation stating what you would like to share with the client at this point of time.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you very much. So okay, so based on the analysis that we've conducted, it seems that it makes sense for Volocopter to start this route between Munich and Munich Airport and Munich train station
Hmm.
for two main reasons. The first is
Hmm.
that they've received regulatory approval. They've found that there's market demand for their product, and they've also compared it to alternative transport, and it seems that even though it is more expensive, it offers the luxury and the experience of traveling more conveniently.
Hmm.
And also, most importantly, they've with the estimations, they expect to make a 4 million profit over the next 10 years, which is above their target of breaking even in 10 years.
Hmm.
Um, but there are some risks associated with the fact that they expect lower prices in the future for their travel due to competition entering, as well as alternative transport infrastructure becoming more effective.
Hmm.
Um, and there's also some costs that weren't accounted for in the model, which, for example, piloting costs and landing fee costs, which might skew the profit margin slightly. So
Hmm.
that would be the recommendation.
Cool. Thank you. I mean, kind of, don't challenge your own model too much when you
Yeah.
present it to the client, but I agree
Okay.
it's a bit simplified.
Yeah.
Yeah, but thanks, Alex. You're through with the case. So, feel free to take a sip of water and relax. And just kind of rethinking the case a bit in your head.
Yeah.
Um, was there something you found especially challenging in the case?
Uh, First of all, thank you very much, Gero. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Sure.
I think for me, the challenging part was probably the structuring part at the start of it.
Mm,
I think I came up with some relevant factors, but I think I uh, kind of came too much from the perspective that they were going to do it and analyzing what the important factors were if they do it, rather than trying
mm,
to decide whether or not they should do it. So I think that was the challenging part. In the maths as well, I made a few small mistakes. Um, but yeah, apart from that, it was yeah, it was okay. Um, but yeah,
cool. Yeah. Thanks. Glad you liked the case. I kind of saw from the beginning that you were
yeah,
engaged with it, that you wanted to
yeah,
solve it, and that's what you're looking for as an interviewer, someone who really likes to be there and who likes to engage in solving problems like this. And I think it showed in three distinct points. So, first of all, I would like to give you a bit of an overall feedback, showing these points and also some overall areas of development that you can
yeah.
focus on in your further prep. And then let's go through the case a bit piece by piece, phase by phase, right?
Okay.
And see how the points showed and what specifically perhaps you could have done a bit better.
There's also one other thing that I didn't mention that I think that
Okay.
I could have done better with the maths is I think that I wasn't quite structured enough in the approach to the maths because I kind of
Mm-hmm.
started asking for data rather than thinking about it, breaking it down, and then asking for the specific pieces of information that I needed.
Very good.
Yeah,
That's indeed one point we will discuss, and I think it's very good that you proactively identify some
yeah,
very important points on your own at this point. It really shows that you learn quite a bit on how to do in a case,
yeah,
and that you can flag your own challenges, and that also means that you can consciously work on it. So
yeah.
great job at self-coaching, so to say. Now let's see what I can contribute.
Okay.
Now, first of all, starting with the kind of positive overall things, right? I think it's really three things that stood out. The first was, from the beginning, you were being, I would say, quite creative. You had a lot of points in your framework. You didn't narrow it down to, for example, only looking at the business case, which is something that many candidates do. You indeed looked at quantitative and qualitative factors and came up with quite a few ideas. And this also showed repeatedly in the case. Right? For example, you had very good ideas on what could potential costs be, how to approach looking for the revenue. So the underlying creativity in your case is I think quite a strength you bring to the table or to the interview. The second strength is, I would say, your energy in driving the case forward. So whereas, yes, as you noted, sometimes you could have done it in a bit more structured manner, still, I always perceived that you really wanted to drive this case forwards and get to a solution. So, drive is, I think, also something that helps you specifically, with such a comprehensive case with qualitative and quantitative analyses, where it's really about crunching the numbers and still not forgetting the big picture. And this drive has really shown useful for that. Now, the third thing is, I think, connecting the dots. So connecting different insights, as you just showed like 2 or 3 minutes ago in your final recommendation, when you didn't just forgot about the points of prices might decrease, but actually integrated that into your final recommendation. So connecting the dots between stuff that you did at different phases of the case is a very good habit. And in general, I would say that you probably have quite a good information management. So whatever you noted down, I felt you could access that quite well in the case. Of course, in 1 or 2 instances, you might have forgotten something, as I remember, but that's with such a kind of big data crunching case, something to expect. There's always room to improve, but I think in general, you connected the dots quite well and managed the information quite well.
Thank you.
So sure, it was really a pleasure doing the case with you.
Yeah.
So let's look a bit at the areas of development, again, on an overall level. And I think they will become a bit more clear when then subsequently we go through the case in detail. But let me spell them out in the beginning so you know what we will be discussing. And I think there are 5 areas which we can look at here. The first one is quite simple. You didn't really clarify the goal in the beginning of the case,
Okay.
right? Which would have been very important, and it tends to be important in a lot of cases. So always clarify the goal. A second point is a bit case flow related. For example, you asked for data in the original clarifying questions already, which kind of didn't make the process very smooth. And then in your framework, you already kind of started discussing in a very detail-oriented way, already asking questions about stuff you wanted to understand before giving me an overall walkthrough through your framework. So segregating the phases of the case a bit better helps you to have a smoother experience in the case interview. The third area of development is, I would say, indeed the framework, whereas I think like your framework was okay. Like it had a lot of different aspects. It also found distinct separate angles of looking at the problem. I would agree with you that you kind of overlooked one very important piece, and you assumed that the thing is possible in the first place,
Yeah.
and didn't further look at it. So it wasn't exhaustive enough on the top level of the framework. Let's discuss this in depth also in a second. Then the fourth thing you have already identified, structuring your walk through the data request a bit better, and really kind of developing a structure and then filling the blanks with your data request, so that you that you are more efficient and more smooth in collecting the data and then doing the calculations. And it was funny because I felt you gradually evolved to that in the case, starting a bit unstructured, and then kind of you reconnected with your best practices and said, okay, let me gather, okay, now I did this, now I will do this. So it got better throughout the case. Aim at making it consistent from the beginning. Cool. And the fifth is your worst enemy is the zeros. So this would be quite sad to have that as a pitfall in a case interview, and it can actually happen. And it's actually indeed one of the math mistakes which is quite relevant because you should be able to check independently if your order of magnitude makes sense, because otherwise you can come up with very counterfactual conclusions in the end. So and it's easy to train. So let's also talk about it in depth in a minute. But that would be my 5 development points. So just to repeat a bit: number 1, clarify goal. Number 2, clarify case flow. Number 3, be more exhaustive in the framework. Number 4, be more structured in acquiring data. And number 5, calculating well, including zeros.
Yeah.
Right. So let's talk through the phases of the case to see what specifically to improve and where you can work in these improvements to do the case even a step better. Right. So first, let's look at the starting phase of the case where you ask questions. Then second, we will look at the structuring phase where you developed and communicated a framework. Then third, we will look at the analysis phase, all the number crunching you did. As you noticed, it's one of the cases where you really have to calculate stuff. And add a lot of it. And fourth, your brief final recommendation. So starting first with the starting phase. I think you did exhibit some very good traits here. First of all, you paraphrased the case in your own words, which I liked because it showed that from the beginning you kind of thought through the problem in your head. Also, since you stated that you have a bit of experience on it, even added additional details to the case, like with the vertical landing and so on, that I didn't go into to simplify. So I really liked that. Also, your thinking showed when you said, Paris Olympic Games must be some kind of promotional event. So you interpreted something, and it was, of course, an intuitive interpretation, which is not, it's kind of not guessed or so. I really liked that you brought your interpretation and your thinking already in to clarify that. And what I particularly liked is that you clarified that we don't compare different options. Because this is really important to be able to do a framework for the specific question being asked. And I did notice that you kind of had this idea in your mind that it might be about comparing different options. And it's quite often the case that when we encounter a case, we already have some idea in mind, because maybe we have done a case which is similar to that, where you might have compared options, and then we try to map it. But then something in us tells us, it perhaps wasn't exactly the same as the thing I'm thinking about here. So very good to proactively clarify that and to really kind of give the interviewer a glimpse of what you actually would like to do in the case, to make sure your structure is on point. Because if you do take 2 minutes to structure and then find out that you structured the wrong problem in a short case interview, it's really bad. So you did that very well. 2 things you could have done better in the clarifying questions phase of the case. First, you already asked for data, how long it takes for the taxi between the train and the airport. And I didn't really see how this is relevant to clarifying the case in the beginning. It's already a very specific question, which you can integrate in a framework, right? If you think that this is important for the attractivity of the offer, then say in your framework that you want to determine the attractivity of the offer, and then look at this aspect, right? So as a rule of thumb, do not ask for data already in the initial questions. What you should clarify is just some context so that you know what you're talking about, the business context of the company. And I think in this case, it wasn't really necessary because you understood the product quite well and what they are up to doing, also because you had some experience on it. And you should also clarify anything that you don't understand from the prompt. And you should clarify goals. So this is the type of question, the 3 types of question you should ask in the beginning of a case. And they all only serve to make sure that you can effectively develop a framework. They do not take anything that should be within the framework and kind of cover it already in the beginning.
Okay. Yeah.
Only questions that are relevant to coming up with a framework are relevant to the starting phase of the case. And this is why the second thing you could have done better is asking the goal, because I would have told you it has to pay off in 10 years. And this would have been very interesting to you for 2 things. First of all, this is a second, in the final calculation, you would have gotten the right angle to calculate it immediately. And second, it also would have given you a bit of a hint that the case will be about the calculation in the end. The term lucrative already serves to imply that a bit. But then with that in mind, of course, you would have to check for the qualitative factors like you did, but you kind of know that you better go through them quickly because you need time to do all the number crunching to find out if it pays back in 10 years or not, right?
Okay.
Makes sense?
It makes a lot of sense. So in terms of, there's a difference between the goal and the decision that we're making, because I kind of thought the goal was to decide whether or not they should do that, but then the objective is related to the goal in the sense of making the return in 10 years.
Yeah, it's a good question. So you can, of course, define different words like objective and goal and differentiate it that way. I would just simply say that they want you to decide whether or not to do that. It's a fair question to ask if they have a specific goal in mind or a specific metric to assess that. So it's not an entirely different thing. It's more like, on what does it depend on you? And it
No, that
might
makes a
be
lot of sense.
right? It might be that there is nothing and that you really have to come up with the criteria on your own entirely. But especially in cases which are leaning towards the quantitative side, there might already be some information on it that also implies that the case will be with a lot of calculation and gives you some direction to place your priority in the framework. And especially in go, no-go cases like this, because it's a very wide case, we could have only focused on the qualitative factors. We could have not done a business case, and instead I would have shown you exhibits where you interpret the exhibits and say, based on this, do we have a sufficient customer base? Would they even want to take taxis and so on? And from that, assume whether it makes sense or not, derive it somehow, or it can be a business case. It will very rarely be both because you don't have unlimited time. So very good to probe for that in the beginning.
Makes sense.
Cool. Okay, let's look at your framework, right? So looking at your framework, you identified 3 levers in the beginning, which were demand, the alternative transport options, and the financial considerations. You then added a 4th one with brand implications. And I really like that you came up with that along the way and inserted it into your framework. Right. So in general, I think it was a pretty broad framework. It was okay. I will show you maybe a bit better one in a second, but let's for now say, it was okay. And I liked some things that you did while creating and talking through the framework. One thing was that you made it very specific, right? For example, when you talked about the alternative transport options, you really said that there are some, but you would like to compare it actually to the high-end options, like a taxi, for example, and so on, even a helicopter. So I really like that you brought in your reasoning already. It really means that you're thinking about this specific case and not just replicate some framework that you have heard, because this is very specific, the segment that you would compare it to this very specific case, right? And also you were being creative. You brought lots of examples for the costs that might play a role, for example, and also for the other points, like the demand and the alternative transport options, right? However, that's also a negative feedback point, because when you look at the demand, you have a number of points below that. For example, number of customers, percentage of these customers that might be interested because they like faster and more convenient transportation. And then you said you want to understand the type of customer. and the price we can charge. This doesn't really have an inherent logic, right? Because the understanding the type of customer is not really related to the other points. You can say you want to understand the number of potential customers, as you did, the percentage of customers that are interested in our type of product, which you also said, and then as a third step, for example, how many of these would probably convert to becoming our customers.
Okay. Yeah.
That would be a very solid logic by which you kind of break down the customer acquisition process in 3 steps, like number of customers, percentage interested, percentage conversion, right? This would be one way, but you integrated points of different type in the framework on one level, which was then not logically consistent. And also that we have another important feedback point here. You said you want to understand the type of customer. I would really advise you to not use that language, because always when you say you want to understand this, and so on, it always sounds a bit like a lot of work, potentially even boiling the ocean, looking at a lot of stuff. Whereas you really want to point out how this is relevant to answering the case question. So you already said you identified 3 levers, which I liked: demand, alternative transport options, and so on. I liked it because it is not just buckets, so you avoided the trap of looking at stuff, but you were objective driven with 3 levers you want to investigate. But then be even more specific in your language. Lever 1, is the demand sufficiently high? Lever 2, do we have a right to win versus alternative transport options? And so on. Really, what do we have to check? What do you have to make sure? Not just ask, like, I want to understand something. And then also the other points below that should also follow the same logic. So do we have enough potential customers? Do we have a sufficient share that might be interested in us because they like that it's quick and convenient, and so on. So here you see that the point like understanding a type of customer doesn't fit. You could say something like, make sure that there are types of customers that are interested in our product. So this would be objective driven. But under the point demand, as said, you have to come up with a logic, points that are on one logical level that answer the case question, the demand, kind of make sure that there's sufficient demand question. And one way to make sure that this is the case is if you have these points, number of customers, percentage of these interested in fast and convenient, and percentage of these that convert, could you express these 3 points with a plural word? So are they of the same logical type, and or not? If it's not the case, you have different points. Like for example, these could be points in kind of the customer cycle. Number of customers, percentage interested, and so on is like a customer acquisition process. But then understanding the type of customer is just not a process step in the customer acquisition cycle. So it's just another area to look at. So you have 3 customer acquisition steps and 1 different stuff, right? You have to cut out the different stuff to be logical. So this was on logical consistency in your framework and on being objective driven in your framework. Now, one more point is that you skipped the question, is it even possible? So you always have to check that you answer the entirety of the case question. And in this case, you identified it. Is it a good idea? You even spelled that out before saying the framework, which I really liked. But then you have to integrate everything that is required to answer it. And in this case, I would say, is it possible? Is it promising, looking at some qualitative options? And is it profitable, looking at the business case analysis? This would cover the entire solution space probably in this case. Cool. And just last word before we look at one best practice framework here. In the very end, I kind of wanted to bring you to the business case because I knew you would need a lot of time for it. And I said, demand is not an issue, alternative transport options are not an issue. And you kind of then said, okay, let's look at revenues and costs, but it was not very determined. So you could have said, okay, my understanding is that the 3 levers we wanted to make sure that there's sufficient demand, that we are good compared to alternative transport option, and that impact on our brand image, that this is all fulfilled, my understanding is that this is all fulfilled. So now it really depends on if we have a positive business case. For this, I would now like to continue with investigating further the revenues and costs and assessing the profits that this might bring. And if you have clarified that before, you say in order to make sure that it pays off within 10 years.
Okay. Yeah.
A bit more structured, a bit more
Yeah.
objective driven, and don't hide your thinking. If you see that now it's about the business case, tell it.
Yeah.
Right? You have to be a bit explicit in your thinking, so the interviewer knows that you have come to the right conclusion.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah,
So
I kind of thought you were looking for something else rather than something I'd already discussed.
I see.
Yeah,
I see.
no, it makes sense. If I had asked for the objective in the first place, I would have been able to flow onto it better, I think.
Yeah, probably. And it's always fair to believe the interviewer is probing for something else. And if, you have 4 branches in your framework. If I would tell you that 4 of these are irrelevant, you would have to look at how to expand your framework and what else might he be looking for now. But if I just kill 3 of the branches and there's the 4th one left, you best show your case drive by saying, okay, assuming my framework holds true, this is the way to go.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so I will now show you one best practice framework. I think for just 2 minutes it might be a bit too ambitious to come up with it, but for best practice framework, it's always good to show one which really covers all the aspects. So it doesn't need to be as detailed as this one, but you see here one way of thinking about it, right? So with the overall question, should Volocopter start operating an air taxi line? Or as you framed it, is it a good idea? Same content. And then I said, okay, there's 3 things we need to make sure. First, it has to be possible. Second, it has to be promising, looking at it through a qualitative lens. And third, we have to make sure it's profitable, looking at it through a quantitative lens. And then to make sure it's possible, we might look at external enablers we need and internal enablers. For the external enablers, we might look at technical feasibility regarding the plane itself. Is it actually ready to operate? And the supporting infrastructure, for example, charging infrastructure. And we have to look at the legal feasibility. Again, looking at the plane itself, is it safe to operate and cleared to operate? And the specific route. And so on, right? I will now kind of just go through it very quickly, but for the internal enablers, I also said operational versus funding. For the promising question, I said significant customer base and attractiveness of our product to the customer base, and so on, right? And you actually see that points 2 and 3 you have in your framework. I would just encourage you to be, as I just did, a bit quicker and a bit more to the point when talking through it, because you save time for the crunching the numbers part, which if you clarify in the beginning that this is the goal, will take time and is important to make sure you finish the case in time. And think about the first one as well, right? It doesn't have to be in this much depth, but you should show that you also thought about it. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. The structure, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Cool, great. I will show it. I will send it to you afterwards, just so you can also compare it. Ask any questions if you have any. But now first, let's go to the other phases of the case. A bit more briefly, looking at the analysis part that you afterwards did. I think in general, you really showed drive in this part. Yeah, like you said, okay, now I look at costs, then I would like to look at revenues, and you were being very resourceful in finding all these items in the first place. So I liked it, and also in the calculation compartment, in general, you calculated quite well, apart from the zeros topic, but everything apart from the zeros, I think was quite cool. And you simplified it. I mean, simplifying to 300 instead of 365, you saw the interviewer didn't join in.
Yeah.
But it was good that you tried to round numbers, like with 350, when you could do that. Now, what could you have done better? The first part, really take time. If you identify, okay, now I have to do the business case, really take 30 more seconds and really structure a bit more your kind of investments and running costs and revenue side. How would you actually, what would you like to know for this? organize your initial ideas, and then after 30 seconds or so, just be very clear with the interviewer what you want to do, namely, due to a business case analysis, make sure that it is being profitable, and then say, okay, I would like to first gather information on the cost side and the revenue side to look at the annual profit compared versus the investments to identify when it breaks even and if in 10 years it's profitable. And now I'd like to start with costs. And then you start very systematically filling your gaps.
Yeah.
Right. So in the case, you have actually filled all the gaps, but it was due to your good note taking and your information management. And sometimes I feel it was not as systematic as it could have been to make it failure proof and to make sure you don't overlook something.
I agree. I agree.
Cool. It's a great case to practice that. A second point you have to improve is your zeros, right? With the 5% that translated to 50K instead of 500K, with the 140K that you had instead of 1.4 million. And one way to do it is precisely as I did it as an interviewer, right? When I said, okay, maybe you should just do 400 euros times 300, and then you have 1,200 euros times 100, and you see that you already have more, right?
Okay.
So just doing some quick checks, and you can even grossly simplify numbers. Like, instead of 400 euros times 300, you might do 500 euros times 500 if you think that's easier for you, just to quickly determine the order of magnitude.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
That's, I think, a good trick. And there's really no option to doing it right. So, of course, you want to be quick, but you have to be certain. So rather take a few seconds more. And then based on that, you also did it right in many instances. I think you should have no problem in developing that consistency. Cool. Yeah, and then going to the very last phase, the final recommendation. I liked it. You had a very good structure of giving a recommendation and two underpinning reasons for it. It was very top down, as you would communicate in a consulting context, which is very good. Especially, looking at someone from an engineering background and not someone with an MBA where you would naturally expect it. You also talked about risks, and there you brought in the prices that might fall, which I really liked. So overall, a very good recommendation, I think. One thing that I missed a bit was the so what of the information about the falling prices. Remember, consultants always think about the so what, and the client really wants to know, what does it mean for me? So instead of just kind of talking trash about your model and about the underlying assumptions, you might say, what do you have to do? So for example, you have to do a competitor analysis and really make sure that you can differentiate yourself in order to justify keeping the same prices or even higher prices.
Okay.
Something like this.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be the greatest idea ever. It's more about showing that you actually care about the so what. Right? So just come up with something that comes to your mind here to don't stop with a problem. So it was funny because the recommendation was good, but you kind of ended with trash talking about your assumptions and ending on a negative note, right?
I kind of wanted to show that it might not be as precise but I understand what you're saying. But maybe perhaps another thing would be to try and increase utilization to account for the reducing prices.
That's good. That would also be an idea. Keep it flexible regarding utilization. Very good. Try to end a bit on a positive note in more of a next steps fashion compared to just a risks fashion. Yeah. And so really, thanks again for doing this case with me. I would like to stop the recording now just to keep it a bit concise, and then we can go on to discuss any questions that you have and to align on how to further prepare. But right before ending the recording, thanks a lot, Alex, for doing this case again.
Thank you very much, Gero. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.